May 4, 1945, in the rugged alpine heights of North Tyrol, Austria. The clock tower of Schloss Itter strikes 10 a.m. as a chilling silence desks upon one of the most unusual prisons in human history. To the casual observer, this 14th-century fortress perched on a hill looked like something out of a fairy tale. But for the elite of the French Third Republic, it had become a gilded cage where the threat of execution loomed larger with every passing hour of the Reich's collapse. By early May, the war in Europe was effectively over. Yet for the high-ranking captives inside these stone walls, the danger was reaching its peak. The prisoners held at Itter were not ordinary soldiers. They were the men and women who had once held the fate of France in their hands. Among them were two former prime ministers, Paul Reynaud and Edouard Daladier. These two politicians shared more than just a prison. They shared a mutual, burning hatred for one another, blaming each other for the catastrophic fall of France in 1940. They refused to speak, often taking their meals in separate rooms or maintaining a frigid silence when forced into the same space. Surrounding them were the former commanders-in-chief of the French army, Generals Maurice Gamelin and Maxime Weygand. Like the politicians, these two military titans were locked in a cycle of recrimination, each convinced the other's incompetence had led to the German breakthrough at Sedan. Also within the castle was Jean Borotra, an international tennis superstar known as the Bounding Basque, and Marie-Agnès Caillot, the older sister of Charles de Gaulle. The presence of de Gaulle's sister was particularly significant, as she served as a living bargaining chip against the leader of the Free French forces. Even the former leader of the French labor unions, Léon Jouhaux, was kept here. These were the VIPs of the VIPs, individuals deemed too valuable to kill during the height of the war. But now, as the Nazi regime crumbled into ash, they were becoming dangerous loose ends. The facility itself was officially a sub-camp of the notorious Dachau concentration camp. It was managed by the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head unit, under the command of Sebastian Wimmer, while the prisoners enjoyed relative luxuries compared to the horrors of the main camps, having access to a library, a courtyard for exercise, and better rations. They were constantly reminded of their status by the presence of armed guards and the barbed wire that reinforced the ancient masonry. By 2 p.m. on this particular afternoon, the atmosphere inside the castle had shifted from stagnant boredom to palpable terror. News had reached the prisoners that Adolf Hitler was dead and that the SS were beginning to liquidate their most high-profile captives across the crumbling Reich to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. The irony of Castle Itter was that it concentrated the very leadership that had failed to stop the German invasion, forcing them to confront their personal and political failures while living under the shadow of the very regime that had humiliated them. They were a microcosm of a broken France, trapped in a medieval fortress while the modern world burned around them. As the SS guards began to abandon their posts, worse, prepare for a final defense, these aging statesmen and generals realized that their titles and past glories meant nothing to a firing squad. They were witnesses to the darkest chapter of the 20th century, held in a place where time seemed to have stopped. The castle stood as a monument to a fading aristocratic world, now repurposed as a holding pen for the architects of a fallen republic. The legacy of Itter is not found in the luxury of its rooms, but in the desperate realization that even the most powerful men can be reared helpless by the tides of history. It reminds us that in the final hours of a great conflict, the lines between victor and vanished become blurred, leaving only the raw human instinct to survive against a backdrop of crumbling empires and ancient stone. The French elite, once the masters of an empire, were now merely survivors waiting for a miracle in the mountains, watching the sun dip behind the peaks at 6 p.m., and wondering if they would ever see another dawn. May 4, 1945, in the small Austrian market town of Würgl, Major Josef Gangl realized that the oath he had sworn to a dying regime was now a death warrant for everyone under his command. As a highly decorated officer of the Wehrmacht and a veteran of the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, Gangl was no stranger to the horrors of mechanized warfare. But the chaos of the final days in the Alps presented a different kind of terror altogether. To his north, the American 12th Armored Division was surging forward, fueled by the momentum of imminent victory. Behind him, however, the fanatical remnants of the Waffen-SS were roaming the countryside like wounded predators, executing anyone who showed the white flag of Surrey or dared to suggest the war was over. Gangl had already defied orders to retreat into the mountains for a futile last stand, choosing instead to stay and protect the local civilians from the scorched earth policies of his own high command. Yet his most pressing concern lay a few miles away at Castle Itter, where he knew high-profile French prisoners were being guarded by a skeleton crew of SS men who might execute their captives at any moment rather than let them be liberated. At 11 a.m., Gangl made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks prior. He didn't wait for permission or seek guidance from a shattered chain of command that no longer existed. Instead, he drove toward the advancing American lines under a large white flag, seeking a parley with the very men who had been trying to kill him since the landings in Normandy. He eventually encountered the reconnaissance elements of the American 23rd Tank Battalion near the town of Kufstein. This was the moment history pivoted on a needle's point. Gangl wasn't looking to Surrey and sit in a prisoner of war camp. He was looking for a partner in a mission of mercy. He found that partner in Captain John C. Lee Jr., a cigar-chomping, tough-as-nails tanker who led Company B. Lee was a man of action who recognized the strategic and humanitarian urgency of the situation immediately. When Gangl explained that the French dignitaries, including former prime ministers and generals, were at risk of being massacred by the SS, Lee didn't hesitate to volunteer his services. By 1 p.m., Lee had received tentative approval from his superiors to conduct what was essentially a rogue rescue mission. The sight that followed was one of the most surreal spectacles of the entire European theater. A single American M4 Sherman tank, christened Besotten Jenny, began rumbling toward the castle. Riding on its hull were American GIs and German Wehrmacht soldiers, their uniforms a jarring contrast of olive drab and field gray, now united by a common enemy and a shared objective. As they moved toward the heights, the atmosphere was thick, with a tension that surpassed standard combat. Every German checkpoint was a potential firefight, and every American patrol was a risk of friendly fire that could their mission in a heartbeat. They reached the castle gates just as the sun began to cast long, ominous shadows across the valley. Inside the ancient walls, the French prisoners looked down in disbelief. They saw a German major and an American captain stepping out of a jeep together, discussing defensive positions as if they had been brothers in arms for years. This improbable pact was born not of shared ideology, but of a shared realization that the war had moved beyond the simplistic labels of victor and vanquished. The alliance at Castle Itter remains one of the most profound anomalies of the 20th century. It serves as a haunting reminder that even in the darkest hours of human history, when the machinery of state-sponsored hatred has ground everything to dust, the individual retains the power to choose their own moral compass. Major Gangl and Captain Lee represented two different worlds, two different sets of values, and two different destinies that collided in the mountains of Austria. Their decision to fight side by side did not erase the crimes of the regime Gangl had served, nor did it simplify the complexity of the wars. Instead, it highlighted a singular, piercing truth, that there are moments when the preservation of life transcends the loyalty to a flag. In the cold mountain air, the men prepared for the inevitable counterattack, sharing cigarettes and ammunition in a broken language of military necessity. They were no longer representatives of their respective nations, but sentinels guarding the thin line between civilization and savagery. The legacy of their pact is found in the quiet, desperate courage of men who looked across the battlefield and decided that their humanity was worth more than their hostility, proving that even at the very of the world, it is possible to find a common ground where the only victory that matters is the survival of the innocent. May 5, 1945, at the medieval fortress of Castle Itter in the high mountains of the Austrian Tyrol. A scene unfolded that defied every convention of the Second World War. Captain Jack Lee, a cigar-chomping, rough-edged American tanker from the 12th Armored Division, stood on the terrace of the ancient castle and looked at the men under his command. It was a motley crew that no military strategist could have envisioned in their wildest fever dreams. To his left were 14 American GIs, battle-hardened and weary. To his right stood Major Josef Gangl and 10 German Wehrmacht soldiers who had traded their allegiance to the Führer for a chance to do something honorable before the world collapsed entirely. The defensive line was a frantic, improvised masterpiece of desperation. Lee knew that a massive force of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division was moving through the woods below, determined to retake the castle and execute the high-value French prisoners held within its walls. These were not ordinary prisoners. The guest list at Itter included former French Prime Ministers Paul Reynaud and Edouard Daladier, along with General Maurice Gamelin and the Leghorn tennis star Jean Borotra. These men were the elite of French society, and they were used to giving orders, not taking them. As the sun began to dip on the evening of May 4, Lee had to find a way to turn these squabbling politicians and 2 different armies into a singular fighting force at 11 p.m. The night before the main assault, Lee had positioned his only Sherman tank, which he had nicknamed Besotten Jenny, squarely in the main gate of the castle. The tank was his primary hammer, a steel plug inted to prevent the SS from storming the courtyard. He ordered the German defectors to take positions along the northern walls, while his American soldiers manned the machine guns on the ramparts. It was a surreal sight in the moonlight. German soldiers, now wearing white armbands to signify their defection, were sharing ammunition and cigarettes with the very Americans they had been trying to kill just weeks earlier. The French dignitaries proved to be the most difficult element of the defense. Despite Lee's blunt orders for them to stay in the reinforced cellars, men like Reynaud and Daladier refused to hide. They felt their honor demanded they stand on the battlements. By 4 a.m. on the morning of May 5, the first cracks of sniper fire began to echo through the valley. The SS had arrived. Lee paced the courtyard, barking orders in English that were translated into German by Gangl, creating a linguistic bridge between 2 former enemies united by a common threat. As the morning progressed, the intensity of the fire increased. At 10 a.m., a German 88mm anti-tank gun positioned in the valley below found its mark. A shell screamed through the air and slammed into the Besotten Jenny, turning the Sherman tank into a flaming wreck at the gate. The loss of the tank was a psychological blow, but it didn't break the line. Inside the castle, the French VIPs were now fully engaged. Reynaud, a man who had led a nation, was now crouched behind a stone pillar, firing a submachine gun at the tree line. The ideological differences that had fractured France in the 1930s vanished in the heat of the firefight. Major Gangl proved to be the soul of the German contingent. He moved from post to post, encouraging his men and coordinating with Lee. At one point in the mid-morning, Gangl noticed Reynaud exposing himself to enemy fire on the terrace. As the major moved to pull the former prime minister to safety, a sniper's bullet struck Gangl, killing him instantly. He died protecting a man who had spent years fighting against German occupation. It was a moment of supreme irony and sacrifice that silenced the ramparts for a heartbeat before the roar of battle returned. By 2:15 p.m., the defers were nearly out of ammunition. The SS were preparing for a final, overwhelming bayonet charge to clear the gates. Lee knew they were minutes away from being overrun. Just as they seemed certain, the sound of tank engines and heavy machine guns echoed from the road below. It was the relief column of the American 142nd Infantry Regiment. The siege was broken. The battle for Castle Itter remains a singular anomaly in the history of warfare, a moment where the binary of fry and foe dissolved into something far more complex. It was the only time in the war where Americans and Germans fought as allies to protect a common objective. The legacy of that day is not found in the tactical brilliance of the defense, but in the moral clarity that emerged from the fog of war. It reminds us that even in the dying breaths of the most horrific conflict the world has ever known, the capacity for human cooperation remains. When the walls were closing in, these men realized that their shared humanity outweighed the uniforms they wore. They proved that the line between right and wrong is not drawn by borders or banners, but by the choices men make when they are pushed to the very edge of existence. In the quiet alpine air of the Tyrol, the ghosts of Itter stand as a testament to the fact that it is never too late to choose the side of life. May 5, 1945, at the heights of the Austrian Tyrol, the dawn light revealed a chilling sight through the narrow windows of Castle Itter. Emerging from the dense tree line was the vanguard of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, a force known for its fanatical devotion and its refusal to acknowledge that the war was already lost. These were not the broken, retreating units of the regular army. They were the hardened remnants of the Götz von Berlichingen Division, and they had come to liquidate the castle and everyone inside. Around 4 a.m., the first sounds of movement drifted up the hillside. It was a rhythmic, metallic clatter that chilled the blood of Major Josef Gangl. He knew that sound better than anyone. It was the sound of disciplined soldiers moving into assault positions. Inside the castle walls, Captain Jack Lee chewed on his cigar and checked his watch. He had only a handful of men and a single tank, the besotten Jenny, parked at the main gate. Beside him stood the German soldiers who had chosen to turn their guns against their own side, a desperate gamble for a future they were not sure they would live to see. By 10 a.m., the tense silence of the morning was shattered by the sharp crack of a sniper's rifle. The bullet sparked off the stone battlements just inches from where a French prisoner had been peering through a gap. This was the signal. Suddenly, the valley erupted in a cacophony of small arms fire and the heavy, rhythmic thumping of machine guns. The SS were not just testing the defenses. They were systematically probing for a way inside. The situation turned critical at 11:30 a.m. when the distinctive, terrifying boom of an 88mm anti-tank gun rolled through the mountains. The first shell slammed into the upper floors of the castle, showering the defers in ancient stone and mortar dust. A second shell followed shortly after, striking the besotten Jenny. The American tank, which had been the centerpiece of their defense, was engulfed in flames. Captain Lee and his men were now pinned down, their most significant advantage reduced to a smoking hulk of steel. In the midst of the chaos, something extraordinary happened. The French prisoners, men who were former prime ministers and high-ranking generals, refused to stay in the safety of the cellars. Men like Paul Renaud and Edouard Daladier, who had spent years as political rivals, now stood side by side with rifles in their hands. They were fighting for their lives, but more importantly, they were fighting for the chance to see a world where the madness of the SS no longer held sway. As the sun climbed higher, the pressure from the SS increased. They moved with a lethal efficiency, crawling up the steep slopes under the cover of heavy suppressive fire. Major Gangl moved from position to position, coordinating his men and the Americans with a seamless professionalism that defied the uniforms they wore. There was no time for ideology now. There was only the reloading of magazines and the desperate hope that the reinforcements Jack Lee had requested would arrive before the gates were breached. By 2:45 p.m., the ammunition supplies were dwindling dangerously low. Every shot had to count. The defers could see the SS preparing for a final, coordinated rush across the open ground. It was in these moments of extreme peril that the true nature of the battle revealed itself. It was not just a military engagement. It was a collision of two different worlds. On one side stood the darkness of a dying regime, represented by the black uniforms in the woods. On the other side was a mosaic of humanity. Americans, Germans, and Frenchmen, who had found common ground in the shadow of death. The legacy of this assault lies in the profound realization that the human spirit is capable of trancing the most deep-seated animosities when faced with a greater evil. Those hours at Castle Itter stripped away the layers of rank, nationality, and political affiliation, leaving only the raw core of human courage. The courage to stand with a former enemy against a common cruelty remains one of the most hauntingly beautiful chapters of the conflict. It serves as a permanent reminder that even in the darkest hour of the most terrible war, the capacity for honor and shared sacrifice can still illuminate the path forward. Through the smoke and the fire of that afternoon, the men on the battlements showed that it is not the side we start on that defines us, but the side we choose to stand on when the world begins to burn. May 5, 1945, at the jagged heights of the Austrian Tyrol, the first rays of the sun caught the glint of a German 88mm cannon barrel aimed directly at the heart of Castle Itter. Below the ancient stone walls, the M4 Sherman tank known as Besotten Jenny sat like a lone, defiant sentinel. Captain Jack Lee had positioned the vehicle to block the main gate, its turret sweeping the tree line for any sign of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division. The peace of the morning was shattered at 10 a.m. when the first high-velocity shell screamed across the valley. It struck the gatehouse just above the tank, showering the Sherman in a rain of medieval stone and mortar. The crew inside Besotten Jenny didn't hesitate. They began pumping shells into the lower slopes where the black-clad SS infantry were emerging from the woods. For hours, the tank was the anchor of the defense, its machine guns chattering incessantly, creating a wall of lead that kept the fanatical attackers at bay. But the SS were relentless, and they had the advantage of high-ground artillery. At 11:30 a.m., a second shell found its mark. It struck the Sherman's thin flank armor, the explosion turning the interior into a whirlwind of white-hot shrapnel and diesel fumes. Captain Lee watched from the battlements as his men tumbled out of the burning wreck, dragging each other to the safety of the archway just moments before the tank's internal ammunition began to cook off. The roar of the secondary explosions echoed through the mountains, a funeral knell for the defer's only heavy weapon. With the tank silenced, the psychological weight of the siege shifted. The SS Grenadiers, sensing the was near, surged forward with renewed ferocity. It was here that the true strangeness of the battle reached its peak. On the battlements, US infantrymen stood shoulder to shoulder with Wehrmacht soldiers. These Germans, led by Major Josef Gangl, had traded their allegiance to a dying Reich for a chance at redemption. They were no longer fighting for conquest, but for the lives of the French prisoners held within. Among them were former Prime Ministers Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, along with high-ranking generals who had once led the French army. These men, dignitaries of a fallen republic, were now scrambling for carbines and pistols, firing through the narrow slits of the castle walls alongside the very men who had once occupied their country. The air inside the courtyard became a choking fog of black smoke and the smell of burnt cordite. By 1 p.m., the SS had breached the lower perimeter. The fighting dissolved into a brutal, claustrophobic struggle. In the narrow stairwells and the vaulted corridors, the clash of steel and the staccato of submachine gun fire created a deafening cacophony. Major Gangl, realizing the French VIPs were exposing themselves too much, moved to push Paul Reynaud behind a stone pillar. In that split second of heroism, a sniper's bullet struck Gangl in the head. He fell instantly, a German officer dying to save a French statesman while fighting under the command of an American captain. It was a moment of profound irony and tragic nobility that silenced even the most hardened soldiers for a heartbeat. As 3 p.m. approached, the defense was down to its final clips of ammunition. Captain Lee ordered his men to retreat into the keep, the central tower of the fortress. They were prepared to make a final stand, knowing that the SS took no prisoners of those they considered traitors. The attackers were now using ladders to scale the walls, their shadows looming over the parapets. Every room became a killing floor. Men fought with bayonets, the butts of their rifles, and even their bare hands in the dim light of the ancient halls. The desperation was palpable, a frantic struggle for survival against an enemy that had abandoned all reason. Yet the legacy of this desperate hour transcends the tactical movements of the day. The destruction of besotted Jenny and the blood spilled on the castle floor represent a rare moment where the moral compass of humanity corrected itself amidst total chaos. The battle at Castle Itter proved that the divides of nation and uniform are fragile when compared to the universal instinct to protect the innocent from cruelty. The men who held those walls did not just save a group of politicians. They saved the idea that honor can survive the most systemic depravity. Their shared sacrifice serves as a hauntingly beautiful reminder that even in the darkest hours, we have the power to choose who we are. It is the enduring lesson of Itter that when the world begins to burn, the side we stand on is defined not by the flag on our shoulder, but by the conviction in our hearts. May 5, 1945, at Castle Itter in the Austrian Alps, the air was thick with the smell of cordite and the desperate realization that the defers were running out of time. Inside the medieval fortress, a mismatched group of American GIs, Wehrmacht soldiers, and French political prisoners watched as the Waffen-SS prepared for a final murderous surge. The gatehouse was a ruin, and the last of the machine gun belts was rattling empty. It was during this moment of absolute crisis that Jean Borotra, a man better known for his grace on the tennis courts of Wimbledon than for his prowess in combat, stepped forward with a plan that bordered on suicide. He knew that the relief column under the command of the 142nd Infantry Regiment was somewhere in the valley, but without precise coordinates and an update on the castle's status, they might arrive only to find a graveyard. Borotra offered to leap over the castle walls, evade the SS cordons in the surrounding woods, and run until he found the Americans. At 1 p.m., Borotra shed his heavy jacket, took a deep breath, and vaulted over the perimeter. To the men watching from the ramparts, he was a fleeting shadow, darting through a hail of small arms fire. He sprinted through the forest, his heart hammering against his ribs, moving with the agility that had once made him a world champion. While Borotra moved through the undergrowth, the situation at the castle turned from dire to catastrophic. Major Josef Gangl, the German officer who had turned his back on the Reich to protect the prisoners, was struck down by a sniper's bullet while trying to move former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud out of the line of fire. Gangl died instantly. A man who had spent years serving a regime of darkness only to give his life in the service of a flickering light. By 3 p.m., the SS had managed to bring their anti-tank guns into a position where they could systematically dismantle the upper galleries of the castle. Captain John Lee, the cigar-chomping American tank commander who had become the de facto leader of this motley crew, stood his ground with a pistol in hand. He ordered his men to conserve what little ammunition they had left for the final rush. The French dignitaries, men like Daladier and Weygand, who had spent years in bitter political rivalry, stood side by side with rifles, ready to die as soldiers rather than captives. Even the women among the prisoners, such as Augusta Brooklyn and Christiane Mabire, refused to hide, choosing instead to help the wounded and carry ammunition to the firing lines, just as the SS began their final assault across the open ground. The sound of heavy engines and the unmistakable thunder of American 75mm guns echoed through the valley. Jean Borotra had done it. He had reached the 142nd Infantry Regiment and guided them through the winding mountain roads with seconds to spare. At 4 p.m., the relief column burst onto the scene, their Sherman tanks roaring like vengeful gods. The SS, caught between the defiant defers on the heights and the overwhelming firepower of the advancing Americans, broke and fled into the woods. The siege was over. The aftermath of the Battle of Castle Itter is a scene that defies the traditional narratives of the Second World War. American soldiers found themselves shaking hands with Wehrmacht officers who, just days prior, had been their sworn enemies. They shared cigarettes and stories over the bodies of the fallen, bound by a brief, strange moment of shared purpose. Captain Lee would later be awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his impossible defense, while Major Gangl would be honored as a national hero in post-war Austria, with a street in Itter named in his memory. This singular event stands as a testament to the complexity of the human spirit. It reminds us that history is not merely a clash of monolithic powers or a series of maps with moving arrows, but a collection of individual choices made in the crucible of chaos. At Castle Itter, the lines of nationality and ideology blurred until only two sides remained: those who sought to destroy and those who chose to protect. It was a battle where the uniform mattered less than the man inside it, and where the echoes of ancient stone walls bore witness to an alliance that should have been impossible. As we look back on that mountain fortress, we see a bridge between two worlds. The bravery of a tennis player, the redemption of a German major, and the grit of an American captain coalesced into a story that feels almost like a fable. It serves as a poignant reminder that even when a civilization is reduced to rubble and the sky is black with the smoke of total war, the individual conscience remains the ultimate fortress. The legacy of Itter is the understanding that our humanity is never truly lost as long as there are those willing to risk everything for a stranger. It is a story of the 11th hour, when the world was eyeing, yet a few brave souls decided that honor was a flag worth fighting for, no matter who else was holding the pole. May 5, 1945, in the jagged shadows of the North Tyrolean Alps, a silence fell over Castle Itter that was unlike any other in the history of the Second World War. The heavy thud of the 88mm guns had ceased, and the frantic rattle of the MG-42s had finally gone cold. As the dust of the final skirmish drifted toward the valley floor, the relief column of the 142nd Infantry Regiment rumbled up the narrow path to find a scene that defied every rule of engagement they had been taught. Standing atop the battlements, alongside French politicians and world-class athletes, were American GIs and Wehrmacht soldiers, their uniforms caked in the same soot, their hands shaking from the same adrenaline, and their eyes reflecting a shared, weary victory. At exactly 4 p.m., when the first American tank of the relief force rolled into the courtyard, Captain Jack Lee reportedly looked at the approaching troops and simply asked if they had brought any water or a drink to share. But the casual nature of the aftermath belied the staggering weight of what had just occurred. This was more than just a military anomaly or a lucky stroke of timing. The battle for Castle Itter was a moment of profound moral clarity that occurred at the very instant the world was most chaotic. Major Josef Gangl, who had spent years as a decorated officer in the German military machine, lay dead near the walls, killed by an SS sniper's bullet while trying to pull a former French prime minister to safety. In those final hours of the war in Europe, Gangl had made a choice that outweighed a lifetime of military service. He had decided that his duty was no longer to a crumbling Reich or a genocidal ideology, but to the fundamental preservation of human life. His sacrifice remains one of the most poignant testaments to the idea that no man is ever truly lost to a cause if he retains the courage to switch sides when the side he is on turns toward the abyss. For the French prisoners, men like Paul Reynaud and Edouard Daladier, the experience was a surreal reconciliation. These were elite figures of the French Third Republic who had seen their country carved up and their people humiliated. Yet they found themselves fighting for their lives alongside the very soldiers who had once been their jailers. It was a bridge built of necessity, but supported by something much deeper. By 5 p.m., as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, the realization began to set in for everyone involved. They had tranced the most violent and polarizing ideologies of the 20th century. They had proven that when the veneer of civilization is stripped away and the choice is reduced to either participating in evil or standing against it, the individual conscience remains the ultimate fortress. The legacy of Itter is often overshadowed by the larger, more tectonic shifts of the wars. We remember the fall of Berlin and the liberation of the death camps, as well we should. But we must also remember this small, strange fortress. It serves as a reminder that the capacity for heroism is not the exclusive property of one nation or one army. It belongs to anyone who, in the 11th hour, decides that honor is a flag worth fighting for, no matter who else is holding the pole. It is a story that challenges our modern tendency to view history in black and white, reminding us that even within the heart of darkness, there are those who will grope for the light. As the decades have passed, the stone walls of Castle Itter have returned to their quiet watch over the Austrian countryside. The scars of the tank shells have been patched, and the blood has long since been washed from the flagstones. Yet, the memory of that day persists as a beacon for any generation facing the specter of absolute evil. It tells us that our humanity is never truly extinguished, as long as we are willing to risk everything for a stranger. It tells us that enemies can become brothers not through treaties or politics, but through the shared recognition of what is right and what is just. In the final accounting of the war, the Battle of the Castle was a minor skirmish in terms of numbers, but it was a monumental victory for the human spirit. It was the moment when the world was aging, yet a few brave souls looked at each other across the divide of war and chose to stand together. That is the enduring truth of Itter, a reminder that even in a world reduced to rubble, the individual choice to do good remains the most powerful force on earth.